Right, good evening everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar hosted by Dengie and 𝗏 in association with McCash Country Store. Kate from 𝗏 and Mary as well, they're both listed as Kate, but Kate's got the headset on, and I are delighted to run this webinar and hope that technology is on our side this evening. If it isn't, please bear with us because I might need a bit of time to actually sort it out. We are recording this webinar, and so it will be available at a later date if you are unable to watch until the end. We're going to run through both presentations to start off with and then have a Q&A session at the end. Please send any questions that you have through in the chat function, and then we'll get to them when we get to the end of the presentations. If you also like, it would be great if you could say hi so we know that you're there, and that chat function will also be a useful way for you to respond to any questions that I might have for you as well. Audience participation definitely encouraged. If you are joining us from Perth, you may like to collect a goodie bag from McCash Country Store when you're popping that way, and they should be available from Saturday, so you should be able to get them from them. Tonight, I'm also going to be running some quick polls as well, as long as I can figure out how to do it and I remember to press the buttons. So keep a lookout from those too, and I'll set them going at some stage. I'm going to start off with the first presentation on facts about fibre, and then Kate will take over second from there because they follow on quite nicely. Whilst I sort my presentation out and get my screen sharing again, just a little bit about me. I'm an equine nutritionist for Dengie horse feeds, and I've been with the company for quite some time now. And kind of my main role, I suppose, is actually looking after the feedline team who give feeding advice to horse owners on a day-to-day basis. And it's a role that is highly varied and that I certainly love. I also own a very elderly pony called 𝗙𝗁𝗁𝗁, and you will actually meet her in this presentation because she's in there for illustrative purposes. She has some health issues, including PPID and insulin dysregulation, and certainly likes to keep me on my toes, putting my nutritional skills into practice, trying to prevent her from getting laminitis. So that's about me. My name's Tracy, not Katie, as shown on the screen as well. And my presentation is really starting with some facts about fibre. So really on the kind of winter theme and some concerns that we might have with winter feeding, certainly dental issues are a common concern. Weight loss would be another. Obesity would be an issue, but overriding all of those things, we may also be thinking about concerns with digestive health, including things like colic and gastric ulcers as well. So we'll have a little bit more of a look at those in some detail, starting with digestive health. So first and foremost, colic, it's something that strikes fear into all of us as horse owners for sure. When it comes to dietary recommendations for colic, they are based on colic generically rather than a particular type. So colic really just refers to abdominal pain. And there are obviously lots of different types of colics, from impaction to 𝗙𝗏𝗁𝗁, for example, but our kind of suggestions are very generic across the board. Most studies on colic are epidemiological, and I'm sure you all know a little bit more about epidemiology given the current circumstances than you did before. But basically, these types of study look at the incidence of a particular health problem within the population. Sometimes they tell us things that we can't do a lot about. So, for example, horses that are taller are more likely to get colic than shorter ones. So we can't do anything about that. But sometimes they do tell us some really useful information. It's not necessarily a cause and effect, but the more these studies show that there's something particularly responsible for colic, then the more that we can factor that in. So when it comes to colic and diet risk, there are several things that come up time and time again in these studies, and that includes limited grazing time, feeding cereal-based concentrates, and I really am shouting at you now, dietary change is definitely the biggest risk factor when it comes to diet. Now, this is all particularly relevant at this time of year because on the whole, for many horse owners, winter equals more stable time for their horses. And this can result in limited grazing time. We might be feeding cereal-based concentrates for poor doers, and absolutely it results in dietary change. Now, data from a 10-year period at ฎ Equine Hospital found the highest incidence of colic cases seen in November through to January. February and March were also higher than the period of April through to October. Now, actually, that kind of study and what they found there in terms of the time of year really does mirror what goes on at my own yard. So, for example, the horses there, they would be out 24/7 in the summer, but come 1st of November, then they have to then come in overnight for the winter period and then turn out again the following summer. So there's a big dietary change involved there. When it comes to specific colic risks, then stabled horses or those that have had a recent grazing reduction were 3 times more likely to have colic as those at pasture 24/7. So what's actually beneficial about grass access as a kind of a fibre source? Well, fundamentally, it allows the horse to be a horse. So when the horse is out at pasture, they're trickle feeding fibre on a little and often basis, as much as they want. They're generally moving around, so they're keeping active. And if they're out all the time, then they're unlikely to have a sudden dietary change either. So all of those things are beneficial about grass access. What happens when we start to increase stable time? Well, we definitely get that dietary change. So we come off of grass onto our normal kind of conserved forage. We may or may not increase or decrease the amount of bucket feed as well, according to the time of year. A horse that's in the stable is not going to be moving around as much, and they may also have time without forage as well, especially if we are trying to manage their body weight. I've also put a drier diet on there as a risk factor as well. Now, obviously, the horse in the stable is going to have plenty of access to water under normal circumstances, but something we want to be particularly aware of in the winter months, with veteran horses in particular, is they may back off their water intake and not drink as much as they should. And actually offering them a little bit of warmer water can actually help to encourage getting them to drink that little bit more. And sometimes we do make it incredibly difficult to eat like a horse. So some time ago now, we ran a survey in conjunction with Horse and Hound and had about 275 respondents, which is a good level for a survey. And we were particularly looking at ulcers in this instance. So there were a number of people who agreed the following actions were strategies to reduce the risk of gastric ulcers. So there was a large proportion, 96%, felt that feeding plenty of fibre or forage to increase saliva production, which naturally regulates stomach acidity, was a good strategy to manage ulcer risk. Also, they understood that turnout was good, avoiding stressful situations, and feeding a double handful of fibre 20 minutes or so prior to exercise would also be good for ulcers. The only trouble is we might know these things, but we're not necessarily always so good or able at putting them into practice. So of those owners that knew or thought their horse might have ulcers, only 67% of them were increasing access to hay or fibre. Now that may be because some of them were already feeding ad lib, or the other issue, that some of them may have actually had good doers. And there are some vets that reporting the cause of obesity is partly that owners are worrying so much about their horse having too little to eat, they're going too far in the other direction. Interestingly, only 62% were actually avoiding starch or cereal, and only 57% increasing turnout. Now, obviously, this isn't something that is always possible, especially on livery yards. So, for example, in my own yard, you wouldn't be able to turn out 24/7 at this time of year. So sometimes it is really tricky to manage all of these things together. Only 56% were feeding a double handful of fibre or alfalfa shortly before riding. Now that is quite a low number, and we hope to kind of get that message across, because that is a good practice, even if your horse doesn't have ulcers, is to actually make sure you feed some fibre in the time before your exercise. You might have been put off by this previously because you may have been told, oh, don't feed before exercise, it's not good for your horse, but that very much relates to our cereal-based concentrates. If we're feeding something that's fibre-based, so your normal forage ration or something like one of the Dengie fibre feeds, then it is acceptable to feed that in the time before you exercise your horse. So how can we support digestive health no matter what our feeding concern is? Well, there's two things that we can do. We can choose the right fibre for the right horse, and also we can maintain an appropriate fibre intake. When it comes to feeding the right fibre for the right horse, this is all dependent on what their requirements are, kind of usually for energy first and foremost before kind of anything else. Now, when it comes to energy that fibre provides, then it's very much determined by the digestibility of the fibre source that's fed. On the screen there, you can see at the low digestibility end at 6 to 7 megajoules, we have a pile of straw. The next one up is hay, the next one up from that is alfalfa, and the one at the top is sugar beet. So straw is a really kind of indigestible fibre and very low in calorie, because straw as a plant, when it grows, it needs lots of structure in order to hold that seed head up. So that plant is very fibrous to hold that plant rigid. Compared to sugar beet, which is grown underground, which doesn't need that structure because it's not holding the weight of itself up above ground level. So in terms of right fibre for the right horse, for something that's more of a good doer, we'd be looking down the low calorie, the less digestible fibre source route. And for something that's a poor doer or needs to gain weight, we'd very much be looking more for our digestible fibre sources. Beyond that as well, considering the older horse, can they actually chew it? So we may have to process these fibre sources in one way or another to actually mean that the horse can eat it. So how much forage kind of is enough? Who'd have thought we'd have been using emojis in equine nutrition, but credit to this slide to my colleague Katie Williams who put this together. But in terms of the amount of fibre or forage that we'd like to feed, then ad lib is always like the best. It's really what we would like to do for all horses. But unfortunately, there are some circumstances, particularly for the overweight horse, where that really isn't possible because we might then run into additional health problems. Under those circumstances, we would then restrict intake to 1.5% of their body weight, which is okay. There's been various parts of research have been looking at dieting horses that suggest that that's a sufficient or acceptable amount to feed. Below that, though, we're very much less happy. So 1.25% down to less than 1% of body weight. We really don't want to be in that situation, and we should certainly be looking to feed more. So looking at some of the things that we might be concerned at specifically then over the winter months when it comes to fibre, the first one would be poor dentition. We have records of the Dengie feed line inquiries over the last 10 years now, and they show a 2.5-fold increase in inquiries regarding poor dentition. So actually, at the moment, our feed helpline on a day-to-day basis, the majority of calls are precisely relating to this issue. And some time ago now, we funded a study that was carried out by a 𝗏𝗏 College student to investigate just how big an impact poor dentition had specifically on older horses. In that study, horses with poor and normal dentition were compared, and their ability to consume 3 different types of fibre within a 45-minute time frame were looked at. The types of fibre that were offered were hay, a short chop, high temperature dry grass and alfalfa combination, which was our 𝗙𝗫, and an alfalfa sugar beet combination, which was our alpha beet. What the study found was that hay was actually refused on 44% of occasions by horses with compromised dentition. So basically, these older horses with poor teeth, they will get to the stage where they eventually know that they really cannot manage hay any longer, and they will just leave it. Now, this poses us a big problem because it means that they're then having insufficient fibre intake. For the short chop, high temperature dry grass and alfalfa blend, that was refused on only 6% of occasions. So for the majority of horses, they could manage a shorter chop initially. Now, eventually, as the dental problem progresses, then less of them would actually be able to manage that, because eventually we get to the stage that they can't even manage something like that. At that stage, the soaked alfalfa and sugar beet combination was not refused at all. So really what this study kind of outlines is that if we offer the older horse a fibre source it can manage to chew, it will still consume it. The desire is there to eat. So from the point of view of old age, being thin because they can't eat fibre doesn't need to be the case. So why do we need to make sure an appropriate alternative to forage is found and fed at an appropriate quantity? Well, it's because of this, because with dental issues, which might include smooth grinding surfaces, wobbly or missing teeth, and gum and jaw issues, can all equate to a failure to grind fibre into smaller particles, which might result in an increased choke risk, potentially an increased colic risk, and certainly a potential for weight loss as well. So there's lots that can go wrong if we don't address that issue properly. So my horse can't chew forage, what's next? There's many people that come to us in a blind panic about this, but there are certainly some things that we can do to keep the older horse with no teeth healthy and happy. As a first port of call, if you are lucky enough to have turnout that's available all of the time to you, then grass turnout is absolutely fine. As long as obviously that older horse or pony doesn't have laminitis issues, for example, which would then make that far less suitable. If you do have to stable your veteran horse with no teeth for some period of time, then we can start off with the short chop fibre feeds. But as I say, eventually we will get to the stage where a soaked fibre ration is really the best thing to do and all they will be able to manage. But they can thrive on that type of ration. And sometimes what we find is the horse that has previously been lean, that is then fed an appropriate amount of fibre, a fibre alternative that it can chew, it will suddenly gain lots of weight, and then we're back in the situation of actually trying to manage its weight that much more. So what feeds are hay replacers? Obviously, it goes without saying, they're those that are fibre-based, 20% fibre or more. One of the traps that I find some people fall into when it comes to feeding a hay replacer is that they just try and keep increasing their amounts of cereal-based concentrates, especially if the horse is lean, but that isn't going to do the job of replacing the fibre or giving them the fibre that they need. Generally, a hay replacer should be a low starch feed. Just for comparison, hay typically contains less than 3% starch, so that's what we mean by low starch. And obviously, if the individual is laminitis prone, we're also going to be concerned about the sugar and starch intake combined, so less than 10%. The last thing about hay replacer is they must be those that can be fed in large amounts. So we will need to be up to ad liber quantities or a combination of partial and total kind of hay replacers. When it comes to feeding hay replacers, then we literally replace the hay on a weight for weight basis. So at minimum, 1.5% of the horse's body weight, preferably ad lib. We obviously feed them in a bucket rather than a net. So again, that's a question we get asked quite commonly is how do I feed this? Can I put it in my hay net? No, you definitely can't. If you're feeding outside, then put something like some rubber matting underneath, because they are going to make a mess, especially when they are on a soaked ration, and be prepared to have them wipe that slop all over your arm on a daily basis as well. If you are using something that's soaked, then don't soak too far in advance, because the feed can go off if it's left to soak for too long, especially in warmer conditions. It's perhaps not so much of an issue at this time of year, but we'd certainly say soak morning for night, night for morning, and then you'll keep the feed nice and fresh. Where possible, we want to divide the hay replacer up into several smaller meals through the day and then leave a larger amount overnight. These types of feeds can be eaten obviously quicker than hay normally would be, so we need to do our best to try and divide it up as much as we can. In the picture there, you'll see that there's a ball on top of the bucket. So putting a ball or some very large smooth pebbles on top of the feed can actually, so they have to be manipulated, can try and help slow the rate of intake a little bit more. And also dividing the hay replacer ration into several buckets in the stable can encourage a little bit more foraging activity. So just a case study here. This is Bella. Unfortunately, she's not with us any longer. But Bella has always had dental problems to some degree. As you can see in the top picture, her incisors are not in very good condition there. She's actually an ex-Argentine polo pony, and she was a chronic cribber. So that's why her teeth are so worn down at the front. That always meant that Bella coped very well when she was on long grass, but as soon as the grass was short, she didn't do so well. So usually she was better in the summer and then lost weight over the winter. Now, unfortunately, the year that that picture was taken, the grass had it'd been quite drought conditions, so the grass was very short. So she hadn't done as well over the summer. And then in the early winter months, she continued to drop weight, and her owners spotted that she really wasn't consuming her hay ration anymore. And so she'd lost a lot of weight and looked in poor body condition. So with my advice, they changed their kind of forage ration for a hay replacer alternative. And come the spring, I'm pleased to say that Bella then looked a lot better. So we had actually had her on the weighbridge, and she went from being 382 kilos in the December picture, increasing to 425 in the spring, with a 43 kilo gain in weight. And that was without a big difference really at that time in the grass intake. So it just goes to show how much of a difference we can make when we get the right type of fibre going into the right horse. She's still got a lot of muscle mass loss there as well, because she was also diagnosed with PPID at that time as well, and that improved eventually in time too. Just to show, not all horses with dental problems are old. This is Perfect Timing, or her stable name is Pooh. She's owned by 𝗙𝗫 𝗙𝗂𝗁𝘁𝗀, one of our supported riders, who my colleague Claire Akers, our performance horse nutritionist, works with. So Pooh was competing at the 3-star, or what was 3 stars, now 4-star, and as a 6-year-old, she did her first 3 events and suddenly dropped lots of condition, which was really kind of puzzling, because normally she'd been okay with her weight. So anyway, after kind of a period of investigation, it was actually ascertained that Pooh had lots of diastemas on both sides of her jaw. So a diastema is basically a gap between the teeth, and with a diastema, food can get stuck in those gaps and be really painful indeed. So Pooh needed kind of a complete overhaul of her diet, including her forage ration. So my colleague Claire got her on a combination of the 𝗪𝗺, some grass pellets to replace her forage, Performance Plus balancer, and electrolytes, all soaked up into a big slop that she could manage to chew without causing her any dental pain. And as you can see on that diet, she certainly looked a lot better than she did in the previous picture. You can still see a slight whisper of ribs, but she is a fine example of what a fit horse, healthy horse, would actually look like. So forage options for the underweight horse, because this time of year does certainly be a concern of us for the underweight horse. The first question I'd have here is, why is the horse underweight? And I think those 2 previous case studies really demonstrated quite nicely that there is often an underlying problem if a horse suddenly is underweight when it would normally hold its weight not too badly. So try and find the underlying cause. As well as dental problems, these days on my list of things that you should speak to your vet about would include things like gastric ulcers as well, and certainly parasites, worms as well, would be top of the list to talk about. So for these individuals, we want to be at the top end of that digestibility scale when it comes to forage and fibre. So we can use things like a wrapped hay, which is dried to almost a hay and then wrapped, and that tends to be harvested earlier than hay, so tends to be softer and more digestible. It's too dry to ferment, like a traditional haylage, and so it's not acidic. So where that can be particularly useful is for the possible ulcer-prone case as well. For the underweight horse, we definitely want to be, doing that ad lib feeding strategy, so getting them to eat as much as they possibly can. One of the things I would say about ad lib feeding, though, is actually to make sure that the horse is consuming enough. So it's fine to offer ad lib, but do you really know how much they're eating? So weigh what you offer and weigh any leftovers so that we can actually determine if the horse is eating enough. Another thing to do would be to turn the horse out at grass if it is happy there, because grass again tends to be very digestible and horses tend to do very well on it. But if the horse isn't happy there and spends all of its time pacing the fence because it wants to come in, then that's only going to increase its calorie expenditure further, which isn't going to be ideal. So an example ration for the kind of underweight horse when it comes to fibre, we would use things like the Dengie 𝗪𝗺 oil, which is our highest calorie fibre feed, but it has 10 times less starch than the equivalent cereal conditioning mix. The 𝗪𝗺 that I've already discussed is a great source of highly digestible fibre. The key thing here, though, when feeding fibre is actually to consider the amount used. Many people underfeed a fibre-based feed because it doesn't weigh very much in a scoop, whereas something like a scoop of cubes will be nigh on 2 kilos. A scoop of Dengie fibre feed will only be between 300 to 500 grams. So it's important that enough is used to actually make a difference. But the benefit of kind of 2.5 kilos, which is approximately 5 to 6 scoops of fibre, is that it equates to lots of chew time, which is beneficial from the horse's behavioural perspective and their digestive health. We'd then add a balancer or a supplement and potentially a digestive aid as well, which Kate will discuss in more detail presently. Most common of all, though, we have got this issue, and you might be thinking, well, why is she talking about obesity in the winter when actually, you know, surely it's not a problem? But it is. So obesity this time of year in the winter months, it's an easier time to get on top of that kind of problem. So we're encouraging everybody to use the winter months to get a grip on obesity. So studies suggest that 40% of the total population are overweight, but if we remove things like racehorses or eventers from that statistic, then over 75% of the leisure horse population is obese. So it's particularly a problem in our leisure horses. So why is it a problem? Well, we're not particularly good at identifying obesity in the first instance, either in horses or, you know, potentially ourselves either. So one thing that we should get in control of doing quite regularly is things like fat scoring. So there's an example of a fat scoring chart on the screen there. And with fat scoring, what we do is we actually feel the horse's body and we look at the level of fat covering their skeleton. We can also do things like using a weight ape on a regular basis to see if the weight is going up and down, but knowing the horse's weight in isolation doesn't actually tell us a lot about their body fat cover. So we need to do the two things together. So who's a healthy weight from these pictures? Does anybody want to hazard a guess in the chat section for me? Let's have a look, see what you're saying. Lots of guesses, excellent. Thank you for your participation. Okay, so we seem to have a combination of A's, B's and C's. And in terms of kind of the body condition score of these horses, for many talks that I've done where I've used this slide, quite a lot of people have actually chosen A. But the picture A is actually of a horse that is carrying too much fat. It is well covered with fat. You can't really see any definition between its shoulder and its body and its hip. In terms of the previous body condition score chart I showed you, the horse that is around a 3, which is roughly what we're looking for, is picture C. I'm pleased to see, though, that there were several of you that also put B into the mix there as well. Now, picture B, that is actually 𝗙𝗁. I told you she was going to be in here for some illustrative purposes. And I told you that she is exceptionally laminitis prone. She has PPID and insulin dysregulation combined. So I spend the most of my life trying to prevent her from getting laminitis. She is lean in that picture, but it is acceptable for her to be lean in that picture because that's how I'm able to maintain her free from laminitis when she is not carrying excess body weight. Now for her, if she's much fatter than that, that's when I'm more likely to start seeing her getting pottery with her feet. So it might be that she's carrying more internal fat than external fat that I can see. And certainly one of the things that we'd like to get you thinking about and encourage you to do is actually encourage your horses to lose weight over the winter so that you can perhaps see a whisper of rib come spring to allow them to then put that weight on again with better grazing. Nobody picked picture D as a healthy weight, and I hope that one's quite obvious. You can see that that particular pony has got quite a cresty neck and lots of fatty pockets across its body and its bottom. That is probably a pony that does have equine metabolic syndrome, quite likely. But, you know, the body weight doesn't always correlate to laminitis incident, but we certainly are aware that being overweight potentially does increase the risk. Okay, so why are horses obese? Well, we've gone from horses in their natural environment that have to spend lots of time roaming about to find the food that they need, from using horses for military purposes and agricultural purposes where their exercise intensity was high, to the modern horse in the domestic environment in the leisure situation, having as much as they want to eat at their feet, not having to walk very far for it at all. So very much a high degree of activity reduction in the leisure population, not exclusively, but generally we find that's the case. The other factor kind of with obesity is that these days we are finding horses are having to burn less energy keeping warm. We tend to thermally protect them a lot more, either be it in a stable or with a rug. And if you think about our native ponies, they are quite adept at living in kind of really exposed areas like the highlands, on the moors, for example, where they would do very well on their own without rugs in terms of maintaining their weight. So if we use kind of these rugs to keep them warm, then we do a harder job of actually getting the weight loss. And if you are struggling to manage a horse or pony that is a good doer and you want to get some weight loss this winter, then actually reducing the amount of rugs that you use is probably the easiest suggestion I can make that will get you a result by come spring. And, you know, we obviously all want to ride our horses and ponies, so we don't want to be dealing with a wet horse at the end of the day when we're ready to ride. So, you know, even just the use of something like a very light rain sheet, just to keep the worst of the wind and the wet out, you know, would still get them using some calories, especially if they were perhaps a bit clipped underneath as well. So it's all about getting them to use their own energy to keep warm. So why are horses obese? Another factor is this. So this is a fairly typical kind of scenario of how we like to keep our horses and ponies with access to grazing and their buddies. Now there's lots of positive things about this picture. Number one, it's easy for us. Number two, the horse has got plenty of company. Number three, they're doing exercise as much as they want to as well. And number four, as we've already discussed, there's lots of trickle feeding and chew time in this picture. From the point of view of weight management, the negative thing about this picture is it's an unknown amount of energy going in kind of on a daily basis or perhaps even an hourly basis. So grazing is very much a big part of the obesity problem. So I like a graph, and I've just got one here to show you what we can expect energy intake wise from grass across different seasons for a horse that's eating roughly kind of to its appetite. So the blue line at the bottom is the energy requirements at maintenance. The green line is the energy requirements in light work. And then the yellow line at the top is the energy intake across the different seasons. You can see that spring grass more or less has a calorie level equivalent to a conditioning mix or cube. And really for a horse at rest or only in light work, it's going to provide roughly 2.5 times their requirements for energy at that time of year. So horses are geared to gain weight come spring and summer when the grazing is abundant. It's only usually the winter months that the energy intake will drop below a horse's requirements. But I think you'll agree, we're certainly seeing some different weather over the winter, and the winters recently, certainly in this area, haven't been as harsh as perhaps they have in previous years. And so grazing's been more abundant. So then we're in the situation, if the horse doesn't lose weight over winter, they're just going to keep on gaining weight year on year. And what about ponies? Well, ponies are eating machines. They have been recorded consuming up to 5.6% of their body weight on a dry matter basis daily. So we've got a horse that we'd usually expect to eat up to around 2.5% of its body weight, and a pony that can consume 5.6% of their body weight. So it's no wonder that we really have to watch our kind of ponies to make sure that we keep them at a healthy body weight. So if we really want to get on top of this weight issue, then we have to come around to kind of managing grass intake in one way or another. And there are a few ways that we can actually do this. We can do things like using a no grass area. We can do strip grazing, a track system, or a grazing muzzle. Excuse my strip grazing and track system pictures. I had to do them in paint or something like that because I don't have very good pictures for those scenarios. So if anybody would like to donate me any of those, that would be fantastic. So looking at grazing muzzles, first of all, they aren't for everybody, and they're certainly not for every single horse. There are some that just won't get on with them. But for some people, where you're in a situation that you're at a livery yard and you have no control over what paddock your pony goes in or your horse goes in, then they can be a really practical and useful tool. So a muzzle study back in 2005 found that grazing muzzles restricted intake by 75 to 86%. That was actually my research, because at the time I was doing my master's, so this was for my master's dissertation project, and I was recommending grazing muzzles fairly frequently on the feed line, and there wasn't any research to tell us how restrictive they were or actually what effect they had on a horse's behaviour. So it was something that I was particularly interested in. Latterly, other researchers, Longland et al., actually found during the 3-hour grazing period the use of a grazing muzzle restricted intake by around 83%, with a very similar range to my study. So that was really good to know that my study wasn't too bad compared to free intake. Interestingly though, in this second study, they also looked at the intake of those ponies that didn't wear the grazing muzzle. And they found that during that 3-hour grazing period, those without muzzles consumed 0.8% dry matter of their body weight. Now, if you remember, we said for a dieting horse, we might want to restrict them to 1.5% of their body weight. These ponies in 3 hours at grass were consuming over half of their daily kind of requirement of what we'd consider for a dieting pony. So it just goes to show ponies are really clever. If we restrict them by time alone, they'll soon cotton on to that, and they will start to eat a lot quicker to consume more in a shorter period of time. And for that reason, we don't tend to suggest restricting just grazing time alone as a very effective measure for encouraging weight loss. If you are going to give a muzzle a go, then they really must be introduced gradually, and you've got to make sure that they are comfortable and fitted appropriately for your horse or pony. You definitely want to make sure that the horse knows that they can still drink and eat kind of with the muzzle on. And we would also just have to look at the group dynamics a little bit as well, especially if the horse is out in the herd. I have come across numerous situations, unfortunately, where other horses in the herd would actually remove the muzzle from the one that was wearing it, which really isn't very helpful. With grazing muzzles, we'd advise using them for a maximum of 12 hours and then bringing that horse or pony into the stable or a no grass area as well. Another thing, some more recent research has actually been looking at strip grazing. So Longland and Harris published a paper this year, and they compared 3 grazing practices on managing pony body weight. So all ponies had access to 1.5% of their body weight dry matter daily over 28 days, and they were divided into 3 groups. The first group had access to the entire paddock, so their entire 28 days worth all at once. The second group was strip grazed by moving a front fence 1/28th of the paddock on a daily basis. And the last group had a front fence and a back fence, but again, the fences were moved 1/28th of the paddock on a daily basis. Body weight gains were significantly higher for those that had free grass access all at once. So in other words, had their 28 days all at once compared to those that were strip grazed, which does seem to suggest that strip grazing may be a useful tool for managing a horse's weight. I think what's difficult here is to know in practice how big to make the strip, because that's something that certainly, we don't necessarily know. But under those circumstances, we should be using our horse's body weight for a guide. So are they losing weight? Yes, then our strip is about the right size. If not, we might need to restrict them a little bit more. So forage in the stable or the no grass area. So here's Kizzy again, demonstrating her nice wood chip paddock that she's been a recent addition to her life. And she certainly is much better off out there than she is in a stable. So when we are then taking the horse off of grass, we've obviously got to provide some kind of forage. And for the overweight horse, we're going to be focusing on the mature forages or less digestible fibre source. And we may have to restrict overall intake as well. So one of the common questions that we get is, can I use straw for my good doer? So you saw it was the lowest digestibility fibre on the chart that I showed you. And yes, we can, assuming that the horse has got good teeth and assuming that it is introduced very gradually into the diet to allow the digestive system to adapt. Obviously, we'd be less likely to recommend it if you had a horse with poor teeth and they were prone to impaction colic. That wouldn't be ideal. Current recommendations are to feed around 30% of the total forage ration as straw, so we don't ever tend to recommend feeding it as the sole forage source. One question that we quite frequently get in association with gastric ulcers is straw suitable? So there was one Scandinavian study that feeding straw as the sole forage source actually increased the incidence of gastric ulcers. Now, there's a couple of things to highlight there. It was as the sole source of forage. We don't tend to do that here in the UK. We tend to feed it as part of a mixed ration. And I think that's the big difference. So if we are battling kind of weight in conjunction with gastric ulcers, we would consider that the supplementation of some straw could potentially be beneficial, because after all, if we can reduce the horse's calorie intake, then we might be able to feed a bit more, which is far more beneficial for keeping them chewing. We can also do things like soak or steam straw to remove the dust, if that's a problem for a respiratory perspective as well. If you can't get low calorie forage though, then obviously the Dengie fibre feeds, particularly the 𝗙𝗫 range, can actually be used as part or complete forage replacers, and even just switching a couple of kilos a day of a higher calorie forage for a lower calorie forage like 𝗙𝗫 light or 𝗙𝗫 can make a big difference. And you can also use the fortified options like the healthy hooves as well, and that way have your vitamins and minerals covered too. So what about bucket feed? So I've been telling you we need to restrict everything. So do we need to feed a bucket feed, I hear you ask? Well, the first thing that we're going to do when we're looking at bucket feed is actually to remove the unnecessary extras. We all tend to fall in a trap of feeding a handful of this or a cup of that, and it all adds up calorie wise. Even half a stub scoop of something like some high fibre cubes provides almost as much energy as a kilo of hay, which would roughly be about half a section, just so you know. And what's going to keep the horse chewing and occupied for longer is definitely going to be that hay. So we want to focus on our forage calories first before we start adding them into the bucket feed. And we need to think about why we feed horses and ponies if their energy requirements are met from grazing or conserved forage alone. And the answer to that is really vitamins and minerals. And again, Kate will probably touch on that later on. So just to finish off with another case study, we have Chewy here. He was a 14-2 Connie Cross, and he first had laminitis incidents at 9 years old and reoccurring bouts in 2010, 2011, which was when I met him because he's on the yard where I stable 𝗙𝗁𝗁𝗍𝗂. He was diagnosed with EMS and then latterly PPID. And this is what he used to look like. I think you all agree he's carrying a bit more weight there than he should. And this is what he looked like kind of after he'd been on his dieting ration. So he was 68 kilos or just under 11 stone lighter than he was in that original picture. Now, when we shared that picture on Facebook or social media, we did have some criticism that he was too lean. Now, again, just as per I made the point earlier when we looked at the different pictures of those horses, yes, he is lean, but he's a healthy lean in this picture. So he's laminitis free and he's maintaining his weight quite nicely. He was also very fit at that time. He was doing kind of plenty of hacking work at that time. And now he is certainly that little bit older. He's perhaps doing that little bit less. But probably one of the kind of more interesting things that I can show you about Chewy is we have a really big record of his weight data, because I have weighed him very regularly across the course of his lifetime. So from 2011 until earlier this year, I have lots of weight data. You can see that starting off at 468 kilos, his weight loss was gradual and he progressed, and he came down to about the 400 kilo mark by the end of 2012. So down to the 400 kilos. Then you can see after that time, we start to get some peaks and troughs in Chewy's weight, which actually correspond normally with summer versus winter. So he'd gain a bit in the summer and lose a bit in the winter. And that's not too bad. The second peak you can see there is that bit higher. Chewy's creeped up in his weight a little bit. Becca and I had some conversations, and it transpired that she stopped really kind of weighing his forage and things. So he was getting a bit more than he should. She soon addressed that, and then his weight came back down again. Now, Chewy has been more or less consistently around the 400 kilo mark for quite a long time, until we came to kind of August in 2019, where he dropped a lot of weight from the end of the previous year, which was actually really quite unusual for Chewy. Again, around that time, it was actually identified that he'd started to have some dental problems. So it just goes to show again, the fact that he wasn't chewing his fibre as well as he used to meant that he then dropped more weight than he needed to. And at that weight, he certainly was too lean. So we took some action, changed his feeding regime again, and now he's stable at his usual kind of 400 kilo mark. So he did very well. And when it comes to managing kind of weight loss, you know, we've got to try and divide any kind of restricted amounts of forage up into smaller meals where we can. It doesn't have to be too complicated though. So what encouraged Chewy to lose weight was he had turnout for about 5 hours, muzzled during the spring and or autumn abundance, had his hay split into several kind of amounts with the largest amount at night, and then he just had a fibre feed and vitamin and mineral supplement to balance his diet. Plus he was at the time being ridden 5 to 7 days. He is now quite an elderly gentleman, he's above 30, so he isn't actually ridden any longer, but his general regime is about the same, and as I say, he's really kind of maintaining his weight quite nicely now we've addressed the dental problem. So I think that is me, and I shall hand over to Kate once I have introduced her. So bear with me 2 seconds. Right, let me just make sure Kate can share her screen.
There we go.
Yeah, okay, that's lovely. Right, so thank you all very much for listening to me. Now we'll head on to Kate's presentation, and I'd like to introduce Kate Hore. Kate is the head nutritionist at NAF, where she has worked for over 20 years. Kate sits on the Beta Feed Committee and is a registered nutritionist and animal technologist with a special interest in dietary supplements. Her job, like mine, is also very varied and includes things like new product development, legislation and technical marketing. Kate is proud to work with everyone from the first-time owner to Team GBR, and when not working, she enjoys walking her dog and riding her native fell ponies as well. So I'm very jealous. You've got dogs and horses, Kate. We just got the pony.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you for that. And good evening, everyone. Nice to see, if in a virtual sense. I'm sure Tracy will agree with me that we would love to be seeing you face to face this evening. You know, one thing I am missing is getting out and about, and I'm not just saying this because we're talking to Scotland this evening, but I do particularly miss coming up to Scotland. I work up there quite a lot, do quite a lot of training with you, so I would love to be up there again. But you know, we have learnt new things, and we've learnt how to connect remotely and virtually, so that's a good thing. So in my talk this evening, I'm going to be talking about optimising gut function, the digestive function of the horse, because the general theme of this evening is talking about defending against the challenges of winter and setting up your horse for the winter ahead. And here at NAF, we really believe that that starts in the gut and with digestive function. So we're going to go through how we can help immunity and defences through the digestive system. So we'll look at the immune system, and we'll look at how we can help that with supplementary support for the microbiota, but also for the mucosa. And that's an area that perhaps you haven't all come across. It's a part of the immune system that's not so well known. So hopefully I'll introduce you to that this afternoon or this evening. So the immune system, it's really our horse's best defence. It's our own best defence against anything that's out there to attack us. And there are 2 key areas of the immune system. There's the systemic immune system, which is one we're probably most familiar with, things like the white blood cells and what you will have learnt back in the day at school, or maybe you're still in education, but the systemic immune system is the white blood cells that you'll mainly be familiar with. But what we also have is this system called the mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. And the more we know about it, the more we understand how important it is. But let's start with that systemic immune system and have a quick review of what's going on there. So the systemic immune system, it's mainly made up of these lymphocytes, the white blood cells, and the white blood cells are produced in the bone marrow. So because they're produced in the bone marrow, we refer to the bone marrow as primary lymphoid tissue. And I've always thought, and I think it's quite easy to imagine, that those white blood cells, they're created in the bone marrow along with the red blood cells and everything else required for the blood. And so when there's a call on them, when the immunity is challenged, then they they come zooming out of the bone marrow straight into the blood. But actually, that's not what happens. They go to a very important intermediary, and that is this mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. So the mucosa covers any lining, any tract lining we have within our system. So the first part of our defense is our skin. So that's the biggest organ in the body. It's the first part of the defense system. Anything coming to attack us has got to get through our skin first. But once it's got through our skin, whether we've inhaled it or whether we've eaten it, then it gets into one of those tracts. So we have what we call the broncho-associated lymphoid tissue, which is the mucosal lining of the lungs. And that's the defensive system within the lungs. And then we have the gut-associated, the GALT, and the gut-associated lymphoid tissue lines the digestive tract all the way through the horse. Now, this evening, I'm not expecting to go through the digestive tract. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with it yourselves. But what I would encourage you to think about is think about the horse, or indeed ourselves, or any mammal really. Think about us as one long, complicated, twisty donut. And when I say complicated donut, what I mean is the digestive tract, and I'm just going to try and find my laser pointer, there we go. The digestive tract is this continuous tube all the way through, right from the mouth, right through the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, right through to the rectum at the end. So it's continuous. And because of that, anything that is inside the digestive tract is not yet inside the horse. Okay, so this is your horse, or indeed yourself, or your dog or cat. And in order to get from the digestive tract into the horse, then it has to get across this gut-associated lymphoid tissue. Somewhere along the digestive tract, and it depends on what part of the diet it is, somewhere along that tract, it will get through to the animal, or come back from the animal back into the gut. Okay. So let's limit that. So let's have a little think about that mucosal lining. I've lost my pointer for a second. Bear with me. Just bear with me. There we go. So the gut mucosal lining goes right the way along the digestive tract, and it's a really interesting bit of kit, effectively, bit of equipment. It's very thin and delicate. You can see the lining there. It's highly folded, and so it has a huge surface area, very thin and delicate, permeable, and it has to be permeable to allow the nutrients and the water to go from the gut into the horse, but it also has to be two-way to allow waste products and water again to go from the horse into the gut, ready for excretion. So this really complex part of the digestive tract has to be thin and delicate, it has to be permeable, it has to be two-way, but it also has to be the first line of defense. And that's because the majority of infectious agents enter through the gut. So it's a really difficult job that this gut mucosal lining has to do. And whenever I think about it, I think it's quite amazing, to be honest. So we'll just touch the surface of what's involved. It would be another 2 or 3 hour lecture to go through the lymphoid tissue in detail, but we're just going to touch on the surface. So if you remember, we talked about the bone marrow being the primary lymphoid tissue, the start of the immune system, if you like. Well, this gut-associated lymphoid tissue is known as the secondary lymphoid tissue, but perhaps what's more important is that it represents over 70% of our immune system. And that's not just in horses, that's in all of us. As research goes on, it's more and more recognized that the largest part of any immune system is the digestive system. And it's made up of a really complex mixture of immune cells and different immune structures, things like macrophages, which have the ability to effectively mop up things that are trying to attack us, whether those are allergens or antigens or disease and bacteria. Lymphocytes, those white blood cells we talked about, they come from the bone marrow into this gut-associated lymphoid tissue, and this is where they effectively learn their job, and this is where they mature into lymphocytes. 𝗙𝗺𝗁𝗂𝗏 patches, T and B cells, which are part of adaptive immunity, M cells, which are part of the mucosa. They're anti-allergic, antibacterial, all of these different things. They produce antibodies. And then at the end of the process, the lymphocytes go from the gut-associated lymphoid tissue back into the bloodstream. That's when they start circulating as white blood cells, as you might be more familiar with, but then they actually inform the systemic immune system. So the fascinating thing about the gut is that the white blood cells come to the gut to learn their job, and then they go back into the bloodstream and they actually teach that job to the rest of the immune system. So there's all sorts of complex interactions going on within the digestive tract. But really one thing I want you to take from that, and that is that the digestive tract represents over 70% of total immunity. Some people, certainly for fermenters like horses and ruminants, we're talking more like 80–85% of immunity, but minimum 70%. So once we understand that the digestive tract represents the largest part of immunity, then we can think about what can we do to boost this gut-based immunity. And I've chosen this image. This is one of my colleagues, Lisa, and her lovely coloured mare, and a friend out on a fun ride recently. And the reason I chose this image is because, as you can see, it's pretty wet and cold and miserable. And I think, and the important thing of that is the wet and cold. Tracey talked earlier about taking rugs off, and I would absolutely second that. It's the easiest way to get weight off those good doers and obese horses. Horses have a very wide thermoneutral zone, so they are much more comfortable in colder weather than we are. So we have to be really careful not to think, I feel cold, he must feel cold, because actually horses are really comfortable down to freezing and beyond. What they don't like so much is wet and cold. So again, that's why something like a lightweight rain sheet is a good idea. So wet and cold is when we do start seeing their defences challenged. That's why I chose this picture. So we can help to boost their gut-based immune system by feeding a high fibre diet, by balancing that diet for vitamins and minerals, supporting the microbiota, and also providing complex dietary fibres. So starting off with feeding a high fibre diet, well, I'm not going to go over what Tracey has already covered very well. So we all know the importance now of a high fibre diet. It should be the base of all diets and based on grazing, forages and fibre-based feeds. Here at NAF, we do have a really good relationship with Thelwell. So I just wanted to put this one up. He can manage on tinned food, why can't you? Well, I think any of us who's carried those hay nets across the yard in the middle of winter can sympathise with this. But actually, of course, we know that they should be on that high fibre diet. However, the issue with the fibre diet, particularly over winter, is that preserved forages are vitamin and mineral deficient, particularly the vitamins. A lot of the vitamins are well supplied in spring grazing, in summer grazing, when you've got good quality grass, but they drop away, particularly vitamin A and E, they drop away markedly in preserved forage, whether that be hay, wrapped hays or haylage. Minerals as well, we have to be increasingly aware of mineral deficiencies that are in our soil and pass through to the grazing. When I started, and heaven knows that's over 20 years ago, we used to think of mineral deficiencies being quite selective around the UK. We would say, you know, in Wales and the West would be selenium deficient, in Newmarket it's copper deficient. Now it's much more widespread. Again, I think this is due to weather changes that Tracey touched on. With increased rain, we're getting much more leaching of soil. Selenium deficiency really across the country, we see it. Copper deficiency, magnesium, zinc, they are all much more common than they used to be even 10 years ago. So supplementing those minerals and trace elements are a really good idea to make sure that they're getting a balanced diet. So that might be something like a pelleted balancer like 𝗙𝗵𝗁, which can be fed from the hand even. It's only 100 grams a day, or something like the general purpose supplement. So now we've got our nice balanced diet with the fibre base that we talked about earlier. What we want to do from there is go on and make sure that we're helping that gut as much as we can. So now we're moving from the mucosa into looking at the gut microbiota, which is the bacteria, the bacteria, yeast, fungi and such like that live in the hindgut. So here they come. Bacteria, yeast, protozoa, fungi, all these complex population of microbes that go to make up the microbiota. You may have heard recently, we've got these two terms, microbiota and microbiome, and people tend to think that they are sort of interchangeable. They are to a certain extent, but they are generally used for two different things. So microbiota refers to the population of microbes in a particular part. So here we're talking about the digestive tract. So we would talk about the microbiota of the digestive tract. If we were talking about the microbes present in an entire animal, and for you and I, as well as our horse, that means the microbes on our skin, the microbes in our mouth, in our digestive tract, in our lungs, pretty much everywhere. If we were talking about our entire microbial population, then we would talk about the microbiome. So microbiota is in one particular place, microbiome is the whole animal. That's how we usually use them. Okay. So this hindgut microbial digestion, we know the horse is a hindgut fermenter. We know that they rely on this microbial digestion to break down the high fiber feed. But how big, how important do we think that hindgut microbiota is? Well, let's imagine we take 1 ml of cecal fluid from the cecum. So to put it in context, a typical teaspoon is 5 milliliters. So we're talking about 1/5 of a teaspoon. So get ready with the chat box. I'm going to give you a little guesstimate now. So in the chat box, how many microbes, bacteria and fungi do you think you would get in 1/5 of a teaspoon? I'll give you a clue. It is quite a lot. So is it 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? How many do you think it might be? Let's see if we get any. I can't see the chat box actually on my computer. So, oh, there we go. Oh no, for some reason the chat box is hiding from me. But I'm going to put you out of your misery and see if any of you said 1 billion. So in 1/5 of a teaspoon, we have approximately 1 billion bacteria. So if we wind that up to the size of the digestive tract, then we'll look, which is sort of 120 odd litres, then you can understand how big we're talking about in terms of this hindgut. So how do we help that hindgut fermentation? Well, it helps if we know a little bit more about what's going on. So we've got all these good guys, the cellulitic bacteria that digest the fibre, proteolytic bacteria, a little bit of protein digestion going on there. Other bacteria that are really important producing B vitamins. Most of the B vitamins are produced in the hindgut. Protozoa, fungi, again, working on energy production and fibre digestion. So all of these good guys are the ones that we want to encourage. The one we don't want is this chap over here, who's the lactic acid bacteria, and that comes from digesting starch. If we have a proliferation of lactic acid bacteria, then that leads to a situation of acidosis, and that can set off all sorts of metabolic conditions, such as laminitis. It can be associated with EMS, PPID that we talked about, but also things like gastric ulcers. So we really want to keep an eye on this lactic acid bacteria and keep him under check. So we need to make sure that we keep that microbiota balance under control. And imbalances can be caused really easily. They can be caused by diet changes, by unnatural diet, feeding a high starch, low fiber diet, by antibiotics. If you just think about the word antibiotic, it tells you what it's going to do. It's going to go in there and it's going to kill the biotics. Well, it will kill the bacteria it's been sent in to kill, but it will also kill all the good bugs. So antibiotics should be treated with real caution. They're necessary occasionally, but we don't want to be using them routinely because they will cause an imbalance in this hindgut digestion. And illness can also cause it as well. So if you, as you would know, if you're ill and you're generally a bit run down, then you perhaps don't feel too well in your stomach. And that applies to the horse as well. No matter what the illness is, the hindgut microbiota can be adversely affected. So we start thinking about these two main players within the digestive tract. We've talked about the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, this amazing mucosal lining, and we've talked about the microbiota, this huge population, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in the hindgut. So do these guys get on? You know, do they work together? Do they work against each other? What's going on between these two main players? Well, it may not surprise you to understand that microbiota homeostasis is intrinsically linked to immunity, and particularly this gut-associated lymphoid tissue. So this is a nice little diagram I found talking about the relationship in people, actually, but from a recent paper, but it applies equally to horses. So if we think about the microbiome disturbance and upset in that population, that may come from environmental factors like the diet change, like weather change, illness. It may come from genetic factors, because everybody, including our horses, have our own individual variations. So some horses will just be born with a better microbiome. So whatever's upsetting the microbiome, that's what's feeding into that. And then we've got this immunity dysregulation, and primarily in this mucosal associated lymphoid tissue, leading to an immunity dysregulation. And those two are absolutely, they are linked and two-way. So a microbiome disturbance can lead to immunity dysregulation, and vice versa, immunity dysregulation can lead to microbiome disturbance. And when you get both of those, then you get disease. And what's really interesting is when you start looking at the gut-associated lymphoid tissue and it's linked to disease, and we're not just talking about metabolic disease. So here's one of those lovely, nice, nice healthy fell ponies that I mentioned that I'm lucky enough to go out on. But here we're just putting up some trials that come primarily from research in humans, but what it's showing is that the link between the gut microbiome and disease pretty much anywhere. It's very easy for us to think about the digestive tract and laminitis, or the digestive tract and ulcers, but actually the gut microbiome and respiratory disease, the gut microbiome and osteoarthritis, the gut microbiome and skin reactions, pretty much anything that goes wrong with us, because the gut is such a huge part of immunity, then that gut imbalance, the imbalance in the microbiota, is going to have a marked impact. The microbiome gut-brain axis is something that's gaining a lot of research at the moment. In people, they've managed to establish a very clear link between digestive health and brain conditions like Parkinson's, and the microbiome gut-brain axis is something that's gaining more and more research in horses as well. So it's a fascinating area, but essentially the more we know about the digestive tract, the more we understand how it impacts general health. So it becomes more and more important to keep that healthy balance. And we do that by feeding naturally, by making changes gradually, and we can also do it by supplementing for hindgut health. So I've pulled up a couple of our labels here just to show you what you should be looking out for when you're looking for hindgut supplementary support. This is 𝗙𝗧. So we might want to feed live probiotics, live yeast, and there is actually only one live yeast that is approved for use in horses. There are a number of different strains, so you might see different numbers associated with it, but you will only ever see this 𝗙𝗵𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 If you see products saying contains live bacteria or contains a blend of different probiotics, then that product I would be very wary of, because it's using illegal products that haven't been proven to be safe or effective. So that's one I would actually have a chat to your local trading standards about. But on any legal probiotic, you'll see it on the back label under additives, under digestibility enhancer, and this Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Look out for the CFU number, which is this big number here, stands for colony forming units, and it essentially relates to the number of microbes that we're adding. That number is, again, legally controlled, so that you know that if it's a legal, trustworthy product, then there's enough in there to be making a positive difference to your horse. We're also looking at prebiotics, and prebiotics you will find a little bit further up the label under the section called composition, because the prebiotics are feed materials. And you'll get things like fructooligosaccharides, or FOS, you might see it as. And the fructooligosaccharides is fuel for the bacteria. Brewer's yeast, we class that as a prebiotic, I beg your pardon, Freudian slip there, prebiotic. Brewer's yeast is not a probiotic. And that's because there's no CFU number. There's no live activity associated with brewer's yeast. The name tells you what it is. It is a byproduct of the brewing industry. So brewer's yeast is a byproduct rather than a live yeast. And then you might get herbal prebiotics as well, things like chicory and inulin and such like. So the prebiotics fuel the probiotics. The best way it was ever explained to me was a vet many years ago said to me, if you feed probiotics, it's like sending the soldiers down. If you feed probiotics with prebiotics, then you're sending the soldiers with their lunchbox. And that really is the best way to put it. So prebiotics fuel the probiotics, but they do also have a specific role to play themselves. And some of these prebiotics have an ability to suppress pathogenic bacteria. So they're also keeping a lid on those starch digesting lactic acid bacteria that we saw earlier. So that's how we support the microbiota, that hindgut population. But now let's think about what we might do. And there's that hindgut population again, the Saccharomyces, again down underneath the additives section. So now we might look at how we're supporting that mucosal immunity. So mucosal support can come by feeding what we call mucilaginous agents. And they are things, herbal elements like fenugreek, bacillium, marshmallow, licorice. They all produce or naturally stimulate the production of mucus within that mucosal lining, which helps to keep the mucus lining healthy and helps to keep it mobile and moving things along and fleshing out the pathogens. So mucilaginous agents are really important. Fibre diversity is another one that's increasingly recognised, and really it's something that we've based our natural approaches on for probably 30 years now, but it's something that we're understanding that not only should you be feeding a fibre-based diet, but you should be feeding a fibre-diverse diet. So if we think about the modern diet, there might be 1 or 2 species of grass and maybe a legume in the paddock. You might be feeding the alfalfa feed in the bucket, but that's still not a great deal of variety. So here we've got milk thistle, dandelion, chicory, omica, withania, licorice, turmeric, all of these natural herbs. And by using them in their natural state, then we're putting a lot of diversity into the diet. It's something that was brought up at a conference last year. It seems with the strange year we've had this year, it seems such a long time ago that we were at this conference, but it was actually only last year. It's the European Equine Health and Nutrition Congress held in Utrecht last year. And the overall theme of the Congress was small things, looking at the microbiome, microbiota. But there were 2 separate talks that both talked about not only feeding fibre, but feeding a diversity of fibre. And the reason that's important is the more diversity we put into the fibre, the more microbial richness, which means the higher the number of species. So you get a really diverse, microbial rich population in the hindgut. So that's one of the reasons we use these natural herbs. But most of these herbs are multi-action as well. So we might use them because they're natural antioxidants, because they're adaptogens. Adaptogens are herbs that help the body adapt to stress. So that might be the stress of aging, it might be the stress of performance. We also use immune boosting herbs. So there are other reasons for using these herbal elements as well. So we get a lot of bang for our buck out of our herbs, and they're certainly not just there to smell nice or look pretty. They are working very hard for the product, but particularly as antioxidants, and particularly in this role of increasing fibre diversity for the gut-based immune system. So going back to the question of the talk, really, how important is a healthy microbiome to your horse or pony this winter? Well, it's really important because it's what he uses for diet utilization, diet production, nutrient production, those B vitamins that we talked about. We've seen how it's absolutely integral to immunity and helps to keep them warm. So that the natural heat of digestion that comes from fibre digestion in the hindgut is that ready glow that if you were giving it to yourself, you might use oats, but if you're giving it to the horse, the best way of getting that warm glow is from fibre digestion in the hindgut. And it may also help to keep them calm and happy if we can keep the microbiome in a good and happy place. So here's a little question to take away with you. It's not one I'm going to answer this evening. Do the gut microbes talk directly to their brain? Well, perhaps I have already answered it a little bit because I've talked about how important the gut-brain axis is and how research is showing that link. Definitely in people, the link between the gut-brain axis, behaviour and mood is established, and increasingly we're establishing it in other animals as well, like the horse. So that's one to ponder on. Not only do we know that feeding a healthy, natural diet helps to regulate behaviour by avoiding the acidosis, but it may also help behaviour by directly communicating with the brain along this gut-brain axis. Interesting research for the future. So let's go back to that question. How important is the microbiome? Well, it's this important. If you have a stable, healthy microbiome, then that gives you a strong immune system, particularly the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. Remember, it's a two-way system between those two. So that means you have a happy, healthy horse or pony. So optimizing gut function in our horses, we can fine-tune their diet, start with the high fibre diet, but fine-tune their diet with supplementary support by balancing the diet for vitamins and minerals, something like the 𝗲𝗏, but also by supporting the microbiota, and through that supporting this gut-associated lymphoid tissue by thinking of feeding this complex of different fibres within a herbal blend. So an awful lot going on within the digestive tract, but if you have a happy, healthy digestive tract, you will have a happy, healthy horse. So that's how we think we optimize gut function in horses, and certainly optimizing your horse's digestive tract gives him the best defense against the challenges of winter. So thank you very much for that. I will, for your patience and for listening. I will take my talk off the screen and hand back to Tracey while I do that.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Kate. That's so fascinating, and it's certainly the gut microbiota is something that's hugely fascinating in humans as well. And as Kate said, if you're particularly interested from the behavioural perspective, there was something called the SMILE project, which actually was looking at the gut microbiota and depression and things like that. And they were certainly finding again in humans that it was that increase in plant intake and fibre diversity that really resulted in much happier people compared to kind of highly processed, or what we would call junk food, kind of basic.
So again, another reason for our 5 helpings of fruit and veg a day, or 10 that it's meant to be
10.
now. Yeah, and make sure they're all different colours as well. They all have to be different types of fruit and veg. But yeah, you know, the more we learn about the digestive tracts, the more we learn about this complexity of fibres to boost the microbial population.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we're going over to some questions, aren't we, Tracey? And I think I was looking at the question box while you were delivering your talk, and I think we can start with one for you. There was one from Leslie that says, do you feed 2 handfuls of chaff dry or damp before exercise? I think it's something I recommend to everyone. So I think that would be really useful to know.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be kind of either way, according to your personal preference, really. And most people would tend to feed them a little bit kind of dampened in most circumstances. But some horses do prefer it the other way. So it's whatever way you can do it to get the horse to eat it would be my best advice on that subject, really.
Yeah.
I've probably got one for you that probably relates to more or less the last slide, or some of the last points you were making. But somebody said, I feed a straight fibre along with a recommended vitamin and mineral balancer. How easy is it to overfeed? And I think they were meaning specifically vitamins and minerals in
vitamins and minerals, right? Okay. What we would normally recommend would be to make sure that you're feeding a multivitamin from one source, basically. So if you are feeding a multivitamin and mineral from from a balancer like 𝗲𝗵𝗻, or whether you're going for a powder like general purpose supplement, then you're not going to overfeed. Follow the manufacturer's instructions, and you shouldn't you won't overfeed if you're following the manufacturer's instructions. Where the concern comes in is a little bit what you were saying with simplifying the diet, is when people start doing a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of the other, then you can get into maybe doubling up, maybe overfeeding. For most, I have to say, for most nutrients, you actually won't feed a toxic level. In equine diets, we have a huge difference between what is a safe and recommended level and what is a toxic level. The one that you do have to be wary of is selenium. Although increasingly we preferentially use the selenized yeast, the organic selenium, and I think a lot of companies do these days, and that's a much safer form of selenium. So you're unlikely to feed a toxic level of vits and mins, but you may well be feeding more than you need. So if you've got vitamins and minerals from multiple sources, then I would, we would advise thinking, do I really need all these? Give the manufacturer a ring, have a chat about what you're feeding, and you should be able to hopefully save yourselves a few pennies and simplify your horse's diet a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, there's probably another one there that I can answer. I certainly saw in the chat box. Somebody was asking, can a pony still enjoy mutual grooming when wearing a muzzle?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, my answer to that is no and yes and no. That's one of the things that we do need to be acutely aware of when we're using grazing muzzles. There could be potential welfare kind of issues. And the ability to groom is potentially one of them, which is why, I do say maximum use of 12 hours and then take it off, which would then, if they're then brought in or into a no grass area with their buddy, then they would have the opportunity to do some grooming at that time. From practical experience, in terms of what I've seen, in terms of using a grazing muzzle and having multiple ponies in a paddock with a grazing muzzle, is that they do still kind of have a go, bless them. It's a bit clumsy, and they do probably clonk each other about the head and neck a little bit, but they will still try. Obviously, if you've got one with a muzzle and one without, the one that hasn't got the muzzle on will give the one with the muzzle on a good groom, but it can't reciprocate, so it probably gets fairly quickly bored. So if, like me, you're trying to manage the weight of a pony with other health issues, one of the things that we do suggest in terms of filling their day would certainly be plenty of grooming, scratches and tickles, because it's a nice thing to do anyway, regardless.
Okay.
Right, I think there's certainly some more in there for you, Kate, as well. And probably one of the first ones, if I do a product one, what's the difference between 𝗓𝗄𝑎id and 𝗓𝗄𝗏?
Right, right. This is an interesting one because it sort of touches on feed law and legislation, which we don't want to get too much into, I'm sure, because we'd all be here far too long. But what it does raise is what we're allowed and what we're not allowed to say about our products. So I do understand why 𝗓𝗄𝑎id and 𝗓𝗄𝗏 look as though they're crossing over and look as though they're sort of recommended for the same thing. And the reason that is because we're not allowed to fully explain the trials to you. So we very often get from our customers and from people on social media saying, why don't you see trials? Why is there no evidence? And it's a very valid question, but the simple answer is legally, our products are not allowed to make a difference. So legally, we are not allowed to say what they do. If we could very easily explain the difference between 𝗓𝗄𝑎id and 𝗓𝗄𝗏. So 𝗓𝗄𝗏 has been clinically trialed on horses with ulcers and found I'm stopping myself from saying it because I'm not allowed to tell you this, but in the clinical trial we had very positive results, let's just put it that way. It's a peer-reviewed, published trial, but we are legally restricted from using that paper against our products, which is very frustrating for us, but it is the law and we abide by the law. So 𝗓𝗄𝗏 is the product you would use. Maybe if we tend to feed it alongside Gastrogard and omeprazole, so you want to try and avoid the incidence of reflux ulcers, which can happen when they stop taking omeprazole. So 𝗓𝗄𝗏 is your swap over product from the vet to nutritional management. And for some horses, they will need to be on it long term. They may be race horses. They're in a stable, high starch environment. They need to stay on it. 𝗓𝗄𝗏 is much more of your sort of equine rennie, much more looking at digestion, looking at antacids, and dare I say the word prevention. Again, we're not allowed to say that we prevent anything, but 𝗓𝗄𝗏 is more of a maintenance prevention product. 𝗓𝗄𝗏 is that early stage swap over from omeprazole, but it would be much clearer if we were allowed to discuss our trial results, but unfortunately we're not.
Absolutely. And there is something that kind of follows on from that. The lady also asks, she's actually feeding 𝗓𝗄𝗏 and 𝗓 Superflex together
yes,
with fibre. Should she feed a vitamin and mineral and only in winter or all year round?
Okay, so both of those are targeted what we would call nutraceuticals. They're both specific products being fed for a specific reason. Neither of them really have a broad spectrum vitamin and mineral to them. So it's certainly over winter, certainly while you're on preserved fibres and forages, we would add a broad spectrum product to that. And even over spring and summer, if you're out on typical grazing, most grazing is quite restricted in its species. So something like Optimum has got all the vitamins and minerals in, but it's also got that fibre diversity. It's got things like ginger and mint and elecampane in it. So I would feed a vitamin and mineral all year round on that combination, just because it's not really coming from elsewhere, but definitely over winter on preserved forage.
Yeah, excellent. Right, there's probably one more question for me and one for you. If I start with the one that I can probably answer very easily, there's a question specifically for a cob, but I would say if you'd like some feeding advice, please contact us on the feed line, because I'd like to ask you about 1,000,001 more questions before I answer the question. But in terms of, she needs to maintain her weight without any excitability. From the point of view of weight maintenance without excitability, then what we would suggest is certainly a fibre and oil-based diet, because fibre and oil are our sources of slow release energy, so less likely to cause fizz. What you want to avoid is high levels of starch and sugar as well, because they're more of our quick release energy sources. So there was one of our products, 𝗙𝗪𝗻 molasses-free, that was actually utilised in some behavioural research, comparing it to a cereal-based concentrate of the same energy level. And what that research found was that horses that were on the fibre oil ration were more calm and consistent in their behaviour and had lower heart rate rates. And there's certainly a few other studies as well that very much tell us the same thing. So fibre and oil should certainly be your best friends for weight maintenance without the fizz. And again, you know, don't forget things like your forage quality as well, because the better quality forage, the more digestible forage that you use, the more it will contribute to the ration, and the less likely you are to have to use concentrate feed to keep the weight on if you need to. Excellent. Right, there's one more there.
And I would just add to that, I would agree totally. Fibre and oil is a really good way of going. If you are feeding a reasonable level of oil, remember to balance it with vitamin E, because oil itself is a brilliant way of putting weight on horses. We would recommend it and keeping condition on, but it does require additional vitamin E. So if you are upping the level, make sure that that is balanced out.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question, is there any benefit to feeding turmeric? That's probably a whole talk in itself.
Our favourite herb, turmeric. Do we have members of the turmeric fan club with us this evening, I wonder? I'm laughing slightly because, yes, we love turmeric. NAF has used turmeric for over 30 years. It is a very good ingredient. However, what it is not is a panacea. So it will not cure a broken leg. It will not cure absolutely everything, but yes, it definitely has its benefits. It is a very good antioxidant. It has some good anti-inflammatory evidence. Again, anti-inflammatory is something you would never see us talking about on our products, because that would be classed as an illegal medical claim, calling a product an anti-inflammatory. But there is sufficient evidence to suggest that it does do that. But you know, it's not that we would always use it as part of a blend. So we have had it as part of our antioxidant blend, as I say, certainly for the 23 years I've been at NAF, turmeric has been part of our antioxidant blend. We wholeheartedly believe in the ingredient, but we don't go around recommending it for anything and everything, because, you know, it's just part of the overall herbal portfolio we have to draw from, really. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, you know, like you say, you were giggling a bit because people tend to fall into one type of camp. They either love it or perhaps hate it, a bit like Marmite.
I mean, and you do get people who are worried about it. You do hear concerns about turmeric and gastric ulcers, and that has come from reading across from human health. So there has been some evidence in people that taking turmeric has caused a digestive upset, but it's actually very rare occurrence. Even in people, it's a rare occurrence. And when it does happen, they're taking a much, much higher level than you would give to a horse on a pro rata basis. And remember, you know, if you think about turmeric, think about curry. Turmeric is a hot herb. It's one of the heating herbs. So if you had a huge amount of it, then yes, it would be heating in your digestive tract. But actually, there's some quite recent evidence in horses that looks specifically at feeding turmeric, not only as to whether it caused ulcers, but to whether it aggravated ulcers in horses that already had an ulcer score. And even in those with an ulcer score, it did not aggravate or worsen the ulcers any further. So turmeric doesn't cause ulcers. It is safe to feed. We do use it in, I say, a lot of different products, but it's not to us, it's not a hero product. We don't recommend it on its own. We use it as part of a blend.
Excellent. There's just one more question that's popped in that I'll answer, and I'll probably make that our last one. But somebody was asking if you can change the type of Dengie alfalfa being fed without upsetting the digestive system. This would partly depend on the quantity. So if we're just talking a handful or two in the bucket feed, then changing to a different handful or two is unlikely to cause a problem. But if it is large amounts, then, you know, between the different products in our range, there are different coatings, might be different herbs as well. So it's always really best practice to do a gradual changeover if you can do so, especially on the larger quantities if they are fed. Okay, I think that is us, Kate. I think we've ploughed through the questions. There was just one lady saying her Anglo Arab didn't have a rug on all last winter, and she was very happy, and that was great to hear.
I saw that. I saw that, and I have to say the fell ponies I ride, they live out on the fells without any rugs, and they are and they can get a bit tubby in the summer as well. But as you say, they lose it over winter. It's a natural yo-yo. So
that's it. And that's really
yeah. It's I'm all for taking rugs off, I have to say. Particularly the chubbier horses. But anyway, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and from me and I know from my colleague Mary, a particular thank you to Dengie for hosting, and for McCash's Country Store for hosting. And you know, do go along there and support them and pick up your goodie bag if you're in the area.
Absolutely. Well, thank you as well, Kate. Fantastic as always. And that all it leaves us to say is good night and farewell.
Yes, safe journey home, but most of you are already at home, aren't you?
Yeah. That's it.
All right, thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks.